So the East African community as a regional economic community is the connection between the continental aspirations for an integrated Africa and the national countries that fall within its membership at a regional level. The idea of having the East African community as an in-between from the African Union to its citizens within its member countries is to make sure that we have a mechanism that can handle the day-to-day realities of what it means to integrate the continent and what it means to translate valuable principles from a continental level, like democratic governance, to a closer level of the citizens, which is the membership of the countries that form a regional economic community like the East African community. So there are both formal and informal ways that civil society engages with the East African community. Within the formal platform for engagement, the East African community has what we call a consultative dialogue framework, a framework that envisions the bureaucracy of the East African community engaging with key stakeholders like civil society, the private sector business community, and other professional bodies like law societies to help enrich the policies, the thinking, and the action points that they try to undertake to foster greater integration between the member countries. So the consultative dialogue framework runs through the Office of the Secretary General of the East African Community. And in an ideal situation, it provides an annual space for all the stakeholders I've mentioned to be able to come forward with propositions and policy proposals that can then influence what the higher echelons of the decision-making of the community does. That's within the Council of Ministers and also the Assembly of the Heads of State. Now, informally, you have bilateral relationships that have been established by certain stakeholders with key organs within the East African community. So, for example, with civil society, you've had deliberate engagements with the East African Legislative Assembly, you've had direct engagements with the Secretary General's office within the East African community, all geared towards perhaps advancing certain advocacy goals or thematic issues that these organizations care about. But then, with regards to challenges, the lived reality of engagement is that not everything works as it should within the ideal scenarios. The consultative dialogue framework, for example, has been one that has had a mixed bag of experiences in the sense that it's not always convened annually and regularly as it should. And even with regards to the substance that's discussed during the times that it is convened, you find themes like democratic governance are put at the back of the priority list. In fact, what actually takes precedence is more engagements around trade and commercial considerations, because the truth is the East African community has been more geared towards economic integration rather than other people-driven agendas such as democratic governance. So one of the things that has come to the fore in terms of improving the engagement between civil society and the EAC has been the potential of civic technology and digital engagement in improving those relations. On the one hand, you find that civil society can tap into digital platforms and civic technology to engage its constituencies to better understand how the East African community works. So, for example, setting up resource repositories online, setting up interactive dialogues that can see discussions around the EAC take place, and that helps demystify the EAC in one way and expand the constituency of people who would care about what happens within the East African community. They also have an opportunity to strengthen themselves institutionally and build networks through using some of these platforms. So online databases, for example, that can register civil society organizations that are interested in the EAC, and also providing a profile of the work that they do in relation to the EAC, can become very useful in creating synergies and partnerships between people who want to influence the EAC. But then on the other hand, there's also an opportunity for the East African community itself to strengthen its own citizen engagement strategy by incorporating the use of technology and digital platforms. I'm happy to acknowledge, for example, that the East African community does have a considerable presence on social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and they have tried to use that as a medium to consistently communicate and update the public on some of the things and they're doing as a secretariat, but then also some of the decisions that are being made by our political leaders. But I think it can go a step further. They can deliberately use technology and digital platforms to not only demystify the procedures of the East African community for the public, but then also create a feedback loop where it's not just disseminating information, but it's also receiving perspectives from the public and creating ways in which they can directly engage with some of these policy makers. It could be creating periodic dialogue sessions, maybe through webinars or podcasts, but then it could also be creating platforms where if there's a proposed law within the East African Legislative Assembly, the public can be invited to provide input, and that could in turn influence how those laws are made, but then also coming back to the people and saying, we got your feedback, we got your input on these issues, and this is what we did with it. So I see technology creating a strengthened loop of citizen engagement to augment some of the traditional approaches. And because we're talking about 7 member states with different languages, with different societies, maybe this is one of the ways of creating and catalyzing a joint approach to citizen engagement around how the EAC works.